Welcome to another Caroline Glick Show. You know, this morning, the Hebrew papers were really funny. On one paper, Israel Hayom had this banner headline that said, "The Syrian army has been annihilated." And the other paper, Yediot Achronot, their banner headline, I'm sorry I don't have it with you, you're just going to have to believe me, is "The accused speaks," with like 2/3 of a page, this massive headline with Netanyahu on the witness stand in his first day of testifying in his trial. And because of the judge's brilliant wisdom in the middle of a seven-front war, they've decided that the prime minister has to be in the courtroom 18 hours a week, 3 times a week, for 6 hours to give his testimony in his incredibly unimportant trial about whether or not he got too much champagne from his buddies. Anyway, so I wanted to talk about this incredible, what I consider to be, aside from the legal issues, which are unbelievably stupid, but I wanted to talk about this kind of sociological phenomenon that we see operating in the legal system in Israel and in the media and other places that are controlled by our ruling class of leftists, was somebody who comes from there and really understands it exceedingly well, Professor Moshe Cohen. And I'll tell you about him in a second. But first of all, I want to welcome you to the Caroline Glick Show.
Oh, Caroline, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So Moshe Cohen, just so you know, he's become like the superstar in Israel because, A, he's really smart. B, he has that radiophonic voice that most people would just like kill for. But aside from that, he's really, really smart. He's a professor of law. He's until recently, the president of the Center for Law and Business in
College of London.
College of Law and Business in Ramat Gan. And he has been making this very interesting journey. He used to be on the left. He was a New Israel Fund scholar, right?
Yeah.
Unbelievable. And he's now a regular on the flagship show of Channel 14's Patriots, Patriots, as the leftist in the crowd. But you know, your thoughtful comments on what's going on, both from a sociological perspective and from a legal perspective, have really been a source of empowerment for a lot of Israelis to understand what's going on better. And so I wanted to talk to you about your own personal intellectual journey, but also about how you see it in the larger situation. So where should we begin our conversation, with you or with the meta sort of picture of what's going on in Israel?
I think it's connected.
I think
the stories are interesting, the personal stories. So, you know, I was a lawyer for the Association for Civil Rights during the 90s. I drafted the anti-discrimination bill in the public accommodation in Israel, which is based on Martin Luther King's liberal vision of colorblindness. I litigated some of the major cases relating to the basic law, human dignity and freedom. So I'm very much into the left agenda for many years. And I went to the academia. I'm doing comparative constitutional law studies, and I was the president of the College of Law and Business. And once I stepped down from my position, I looked at what is going on in Israel and was very much disturbed. I saw
When is this around?
That was 3 years ago.
So it was when Netanyahu's trial was already started?
Yeah. It was already started, and I didn't really dwell very much deep into the trial. Now I'm much more into it. And what I saw was a massive transfer of power from the democratic institution, which is the Knesset, the government.
The elected institutions.
Yeah, to what is called the gatekeeper, which are basically the courts, the academia, some of the finance institution. And I was very much curious, how come we got to a position where so much power has been transferred without any explicit authorization in the law? And the journey starts in...
I think that's a really key point you just said. There's no explicit authorization in the law. And in fact, in many cases, the law seems to bar what they're doing. And yet, like, this is, I call it's an arrogation of power from the elected officials, from the elected leaders, that they've just taken on themselves.
Yeah. The story is a sociological one.
Okay.
It started in 1977 when the left, for the first time, lost. And the Labour Party, which established the Zionist movement, the State of Israel, this is how they conceived themselves, were very much in an anxiety. How come we let now Begin, the right-wingers, these crazy lunatic people, rule us.
Who they had been disparaging and delegitimizing for the previous, 50 years.
For many years. Many Americans know that with regard to how Trump is being labeled as Hitler, which is basically to delegitimize him.
And Reagan was Hitler.
Yeah. So it's very interesting that a few days before power is being transmitted to the newly elected government from the Likud party, from the right wing, the government had adopted a decision on the 6th of June, 6/6, 1977, and the number of the decision is 666. Very symbolic.
For people in Hitler.
This decision basically transferred a lot of autonomy and powers to the universities. This is where our people are. We need to shift power from these lunatic people from the right wing in the Knesset to the universities. And then the second step was when Aaron Barak, who is a highly charismatic, who believes that the law is everywhere and everything is law, entered the Israeli Supreme Court.
Well, first he was legal advisor. He was the attorney general of Begin.
Yeah, he was the legal advisor during the Camp David Accord, and he was highly charismatic, and Begin was very...
taken.
Very much taken by him, appointed him to the Israeli Supreme Court.
Wait, just so that I get the chronology correct. So it was the 6th of June, 1977. When did Begin establish his government? Also
a few days after that. It was really a few days before shifting the power to the right-wing government.
And what was the power that they gave to the university?
They gave them autonomy to allocate resources to different projects in the university, which is the major power of the university, is their autonomy on the resources, okay? And then the next step was the legal arena.
Revolution.
Okay. So there was a political need from the left wing to be protected from the politician and the Knesset and the right-wing government. And there was a highly charismatic Supreme Court Justice, Aaron Barak, who believes that law is everywhere, who is also progressive, liberal progressive in his agenda. And look what happens. Barak was a strategic player. He was in the Supreme Court for 28 years, while politicians come and go every 2 years. So in the 80s, Barak did 3 steps. First, the whole idea that some issues are political and the court should not intervene has been diluted. Second,
with the standing?
No, not the standing, the justiciability standard.
Okay.
The second step was the standing. Everyone can petition the Supreme Court, which opened the floor for the whole left-wing agenda organization, NGOs, to petition on almost everything to the Supreme Court. And the third step was what is called the reasonable test,
right,
which basically, under British law from 1947, basically says that only in a very extreme cases where only crazy people could have adopted a certain position or policy, then the court would strike it down.
Can you give an example of what a lunatic position would be?
It's so hard to bring an example because there are hardly any example.
So why did they even adopt the rule?
They adopted it for very, very extreme cases. But you know what the court said, Aaron Barak, he said, well, this is not only for extreme cases. This also applies whenever the government did not really weigh the different interests on the scale. So you have a major shift in the way the courts think in the 80s.
But why didn't anybody stop him? I mean, that's such a crazy thing to say everything is justiciable and that everybody has standing and that you can just you can determine anything not on the basis of law, that there can be a judgment not on the basis of...
There are two reasons for that. First, the right wing was too formal, too state-oriented, and they believe in the institution, which is the Supreme Court and Aaron Barak.
So they were naive.
They were naive, definitely. And second, the left wing is not democratic. And they need the Supreme Court to veto any decision that is made by the right-wing government. So they have an inherent interest in that.
So the right is naive and the left is relentless.
Sure. You know, when you feel that you lose your hegemony And in terms of demographic, you're on the losing side. And if you look at the election, usually the right wing wins in almost every election. Then you need other sources of protection to protect your hegemony. So the second stage was a very interesting move, which is the basic law, human dignity and freedom,
which you
from the
champion of.
Yeah, there was a coalition of right-wingers and left-wingers working together from the elite, from both sides, to push forward this bill of rights.
Lynn, Dan Merritt, all of these.
And it was supposed to be some kind of compromise, a very limited constitutional bill. But Aaron Barak immediately after the
But what does it say?
It basically protects certain fundamental rights such as life, liberty, property. There is no protection to equality, no protection to freedom of speech, no protection of freedom of religion because of some kind of compromise with the religious parties. So what Barak did, he took this.
Nobody thought it was important. Like almost nobody even was in the Knesset.
Yeah, it's amazing. In the Israeli Knesset, there are 120 members and 32 voted for, 21 voted against. And we're speaking about a constitution. Usually when you adopt a constitution, there is a 2/3 requirement in most constitutional bills.
People didn't even realize that what was being discussed was going to be important.
I was at that time a third-year student at the law school at the Hebrew University, and I was very much interested in constitutional law, administrative law. And, one day I opened Yediot Achronot, which is the most important newspaper at that time. And I see in a very small kind of article saying that yesterday the Israeli Knesset adopted 2 basic laws, the human dignity and freedom of occupation. I say, what? How come I was very interested in constitutional law? I didn't even know about it. So it was under the radar, and it was supposed to be a very limited Bill of Rights. But what Barak did, he published 2 articles, labeling it a constitutional revolution. And then he pushed to extend this Bill of Rights and change it into a full-blown constitution, and also change all the other precedent that said that the basic laws of Israel are not constitutional bill until this whole project is being finished.
So he wrote an article. I write articles every week. I mean, why does it matter that he wrote an article?
He writes article, and then everything that starts as academic article turns out to be jurisprudence of the Israeli Supreme Court. So in 1995, the Israeli Supreme Court followed the very charismatic and very smart legacy and position of Aaron Barak and said that the basic law, human dignity and freedom, is a constitution. And then it started to extend it more and more and more.
And more. I mean, nobody agreed with them. This was just something that they were doing in-house.
There is a basis for that because it was adopted legally, and it says whenever you infringe upon a constitutional right, it has to be for a worthy cause and it has to be proportional. So if you look at the structure of the basic law, it does refer to some kind of a constitutional structure, like the Canadian Charter for Rights and Freedom from 1982. So that was the model, but it wasn't supposed to be that vast as Aaron Barak actually did. So, and the last step of this massive extension of power is the fact that the Israeli Supreme Court, not during Barak era, but during President Hayut, only recently, on January 1st, 2024, issued a major decision which is actually changed the legal regime of Israel. Israel is no longer a democracy. Israel is now a juristocracy.
Right. But before we get into that, because you're right, but this is sort of the coup de grace, and I want to just get there for a second. So in the 1980s, he expanded the writ of the court in a way that made it essentially limitless.
It was limited to a position where the legislator could veto any and override any judicial decision of the Supreme Court. But if the law was very explicit and it override what the court said, that was okay. What has changed in the 90s is that the court says, no, now we can strike even laws that violate the basic law, human dignity and freedom.
Okay, and so and there's no I remember also when I was here, I think as a student before I made Aliyah, I can't remember anymore, but in the late 80s and 90s, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel were pushing this idea of a constitution for Israel. And a lot of people were getting involved with it. And I remember signing a petition for it and stuff like that. But so there was this sense that, okay, we finally are going to get a constitution. There was sort of a public mood for that in Israel. But there was no sense that we had adopted one. I mean, and I just, to me, is it because Rabin was prime minister during the early 90s? I know that he...
No, it was adopted during a Shamir government. Dan Meridor was the Minister of Justice from the right wing, but he was from the elite, the liberal elite that created a coalition with the liberal left. And that
Before
was
we get the coup de grace of what Esther Chayut did, which was after the year of rioting of the left, which we all experienced before October 7th, explain to me a little bit, because I think what we've seen over the years is that the left can win if the leader of the left-wing party pretends to be on the right. And that's what Rabin did in 92. I voted for him. I thought that he was just Shamir with a better haircut. Really, that's what I thought. And I had no idea what I was getting into. But Barack also pretended that he was a right-winger. They all do. That's how they get elected. I think the one who didn't do that was Ehud Olmert, but he was a Likudnik, so he had that, and the people are on the right, and yet we see that, and then you have this incredible radicalization of the left, partially guided or in large part guided by the court throughout the 90s, the 2000s, and so why? I mean, explain what do you account for the radicalization that led us to the point where when the right finally said we've had enough in January of 2023 and we want to reform the system, people went ballistic. Because there was also a massive polarization of Israeli society that this caused, that what Barak did caused.
There are two levels of reply to your question. First, in terms of political morality, what you also see in the US is that the right wing is almost all the time the same position, even becoming more liberal than it used to be in the past, while the left wing has become crazily woke, went to the extreme.
Right.
This is why Trump won, because the left does not actually reflect the position of the mainstream American. The same is true with regard to Israel, because the Israeli left also duplicates the American left. Many people go to the academia, they are exposed to the woke ideology, they bring it back to Israel. The New Israel Fund, which used to be once funded by liberal Jews, now is being funded by progressive woke Jews. So they changed the whole environment. So they went very strongly to the left. That's one explanation. The second explanation is that the legal system became arrogant. And the legal system looked from high to the people and to the representative in the Knesset. And whenever the representative wanted to gain the power back to the Knesset, for example, when they adapted or changed the basic law themselves, now the juristocracy, the legal system was fearful. Well, now they have a new mechanism. They can change the basic law, and what can we do? This is why they developed this very crazy notion of unconstitutional constitutional amendment, which we will address shortly, which basically says that we, the judges, are the sovereign. In Israel, I always say, well, when you look at the American Constitution, it says we, the people. In Israel, it's we, the judges.
It is.
That's the supreme power. And because many people in the left believe that they are all going to be almost all the time in the minority, they adopt the position. So they are not Democrat. So you have both the legal system reacting to some kind of pushback from the political system. When the political system changed the basic law, now we need another mechanism to override what they are doing. So they use this unconstitutional constitutional amendment mechanism. And you see also radicalization that duplicates what is going on in the US and bringing it to the Israeli media, to the Israeli academia, to the Israeli culture, to the Israeli NGOs from the left wing. And that creates what we see both in Israel and the US, an extreme rise in political polarization. And in Israel, it is also related to a decline of hegemony of people who believe that they built the state of Israel. And you have all these kind of baboons, all these kinds of messianic people, crazy people from the right wing who want to take hold of their own creation and ruin the state of Israel.
You know, I think that there was a singular moment. I mean, there have been a lot of singular moments that just popped into my brain right now when you're talking about that, about how when the riots against Netanyahu, the political violence on the left started before his trial. It started, and it didn't start over his trial. It was Corona. It was all these other things. And I think during the riots outside of the prime minister's residence during Corona, this happened where they're trying to break through to the prime minister's residence, break through the roadblocks, and there was a policewoman there who was whose family came from Ethiopia. And Amir, what's his name? Amir Chayud, one of these retired pilots who were just these radicals. Amir Askel. I think he's a brigadier general, maybe even from the Air Force. He's one of the leaders of this elites revolt. Started screaming at her, "How dare you move me? I brought your parents to Israel."
Yeah, very patronizing.
It was repulsive.
Yeah.
It was repulsive, and it actually made the news. I don't know if it made Channel 14 news only or whether it was all over the country.
Yeah, it was in the mainstream media also. Yeah,
and it was a sort of a singular moment because that's exactly how they feel about the people of Israel.
Definitely.
You owe me. You're basically, this is how they always treat me. I've been here 30 plus years. And when they attack me online, they say that I'm a tourist, you know, and like I'm not a real Israeli. And
Ron Dermer, this is what they're saying about Ron Dermer, that he's not a real Israeli. It's an argument that is only leveled against right wingers, not against left wingers.
Right, of course. I mean, if the woman whose family came from Ethiopia had been at their rally, they would have put her in front of the camera so everybody saw that they had an Ethiopian.
Do you know when I realized that? You know, after the election and the right-wing government won and the Minister of Justice Yair Levin launched this reform, I tried to create connections and some kind of deliberation between Kohelet, which is the right-wing think tank that was behind the mastermind of this reform, and
my friends.
Yeah. And some people from the academia, from the left, who are more moderate, and we try to launch this deliberation and reach some kind of agreement. And during this negotiation, there was a very heated debate regarding the legal advisor authorities. You know, in Israel, the power of the legal advisor attorney general is crazy. I think there is even not a single jurisdiction across the globe that there is an entity that has even half of the power of the Attorney General of Israel. So you have from the left wing, you have a law professor struggling to maintain as much power for the Attorney General. And the person from the right wing said, "You think that we are baboons?" And I said, "What is he talking about? What kind of baboon is he referring to?" And the law professor from the left wing became red, shouted, "I never said baboons. I never said baboons." And he shouted, he smashed the door and went out to the street. And during this...
I said fascists, not baboons, right?
You know, but that was a very revealing moment for me because I understood that as a constitutional law professor who engages in constitutional design and comparative constitutional law, my expertise is irrelevant. The issue, the subject, the topic is a struggle over hegemony, who controls Israel. That's the story, and you see how people from the right wing believe that people from the left wing look at them in a way that is condescending, okay, from the above. And at that moment, I delve much more into the power struggle, the sociological struggle, what is actually going on in Israel, because I realized that if we want to solve the constitutional overall or crisis that is going on in Israel, we need to address the roots of the sociological struggle in Israel.
So here, we can take this in so many different directions, but just to stay, close to this, I mean, even now with what is the demand of the left regarding the war? They are demanding that we have a commission of inquiry that will be controlled by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's called the State Inquiry Commission. The states, which actually means that the person that nominates the members of this committee is the president of the Supreme Court, which is very anti-government.
Right, and he's a radical leftist, but the government doesn't want him, and nobody wanted him. Nobody voted for him except his fellow jurists or justices. But and the right wing, the government's position is we want to pass a law that will give equal say to the opposition and the government, and it's always and what's amazing, and we saw it also in the riots against judicial reform, was that people on the right were trying to reach a compromise. They were willing to reach a compromise, and people on the left wouldn't. And they took I was very disappointed when Yariv Levin got up and gave his speech and announced the reforms, because I thought, why so little? I felt like what he was planning on doing wasn't going to justify all the work, because it wasn't what we needed. We needed a much more serious curtailment of the power of the legal system and checks and balances back in our system. But all the same, that was what nearly set off, I would say, a civil war in Israel. We were in a civil war. Only one side was fighting and the other side kept trying to reach compromise.
I tell you what's the difference, if you compare Israel to the U.S., look what is going on now in the U.S. You have President Trump from the right wing, you have the Senate right wing, you have the House right wing, and you have the Supreme Court right wing. Okay, so in America, the right wing has power on some of the major institutions. Okay, in Israel,
no,
the right wing has no power at all, but from the government and for the Israeli Knesset, all the academia leftist, all the Supreme Court leftist, all the finance leftist. Almost every institution, the bureaucracy, the deep state, everything is leftist. So when you engage in such a dramatic shift of power, you need to be a bit more smart, okay, and more sophisticated, and to realize that it's going to be a long struggle, because, we are now experiencing the Netanyahu trial, okay? And, if you look in history and you see another trial, the Dreyfus trial, during the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, it took 17 years for that trial. And that trial was not only a trial about Dreyfus, it was a trial about a shift of hegemony in France from the general, the church, and the courts on the right wing, which were the corrupted one, and you have the democratic power on the other one. And when people struggled and fought about the Dreyfus trial, they actually were struggling about hegemony. This is what is going on in Israel. It's both about the the constitutional crisis, and it's also related to the Netanyahu trial. It's a trial against the people of Israel, because some of the accusations are so vague, so fragile, that you're asking yourself, well, you're indicting a prime minister. You need very strong evidence, and you don't have them. So what is this trial really about? And you read and you hear in the Israeli leftist media, the only reason that they're actually litigating this trial is to set Netanyahu aside, because Netanyahu is being conceived as the major power that actually is an Hercule that holds together all the right wing. And once Netanyahu is stepped down, the right wing is going to fall. That's their strategy.
It's so... in his first day of testimony yesterday, his attorney, Amit Haddad, asked him to, and initially I didn't really understand what was going on, and then I did. Amit Haddad said to the prime minister, look, before we get into the actual, nuts and bolts of the charges against you, can you please put this period of, 10 to 14, I think, or something like that, or the allegations against him, can you put it into the context of what was going on in Israel at the time when you're prime minister? And, he talked about how he was under extraordinary pressure from the Obama administration to quit Judea and Samaria and to allow for the formation of a Palestinian state. And they had this crazy argument was, oh, you don't have to worry about the Palestinians. They're going to be just like the Afghan security forces. We're going to train them. The Americans are going to train the Palestinians just as we did in Afghanistan. Come take a secret visit to Afghanistan and you can see how they're being trained. And Netanyahu said, you're insane, because the minute that you leave Afghanistan, they're going to become Taliban, which in the event is precisely what occurred. And he talked about how he was being just killed in the media for standing up to Obama. Just killed. They were attacking him every single day. I certainly remember that. And I was supporting him. And he was also being killed by people like myself, because the one thing that he did with Obama, and this has always been Netanyahu's modus operandi with hostile presidents, is that he gave them something temporary in order to avoid having to give them something permanent. So he gave them a 10-month building freeze in Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem.
And the declaration that he believes also in a two-state nation. Yeah.
So, he gave him a declaration, and he did the temporary freeze on Jewish property rights in Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem in order to get them off his back. And then he got massively attacked by people on the right who were like, what are you doing? And the answer was he was trying to get out from under this. And so the point was that everything that he's basically being accused of is all about the media being anti-Netanyahu, and not just anti-Netanyahu, hegemonic in their views and blocking anybody from the discourse who has opposing views. So in the past, they shut down Arutz Sheva. They were trying to shut down Yisrael Hayom at that time, and now they're trying desperately to shut down Channel 14. And it was that part of the hegemonic power of the left that he was trying to whittle away. And for that, he's been on trial for the past 4 years. And he now is supposed to waste, in the middle of a war for our national survival, 18 hours a week on the stand.
It's a trial about consciousness. Because, if you look at the state of Israel, traditionally, almost all the Israeli media was leftist. That's the hegemonic understanding of how people in Israel should think. So whenever Netanyahu, and if you look at the indictment against him, almost every indictment is related to the media.
Exactly.
So some of the journalists, they're initiated some of them, and some of them are cases in which Netanyahu actually tried to shift a bit the direction of the boat to a more moderate, to diversify the media. But for the hegemonic, whenever you try to diversify, they conceive it as an attempt to control. Whenever Yariv Levin tried to diversify the Israeli Supreme Court, that's an attempt to control the court. So that's the major issue. And by the way, if you look across the globe, not only in Israel, not only in the US, you see across the globe a major struggle about controlling institutions that were captured by the left, and the right wing wants to bring it back to the people. You see it in Europe, you see it in the US, you see it in Israel, you see it in many other countries.
Latin America. So this is why we are experiencing also a dramatic rise in political polarization. It's not only the echo chamber of the media, it's an actual struggle over control, which raises anxiety over the side that loses. Okay, that's the major struggle. So how do we, I look at this, and I remember I was talking to a friend of mine, Rotem Sala, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and I said, we're not getting anywhere. And I said, I've been writing about the judiciary for over 20 years, and it doesn't seem like we're ever getting any progress. And he said, Caroline, look, I think it was before the last election. He said, look, we're already at the point we're almost at 61 members. And then we got 64 members in 2023 that were for judicial reform. So you finally got an absolute majority of members of Knesset. But then they set the country on fire when we tried to use that 64-seat majority. And it just feels like, we're fighting a war and they're trying to make us lose it in order to protect their position.
So for the right wing, it's a long struggle. When the woke people decided to capture the institution, they called it the long march through the institution. Right. And when the Federalist Society decided to overturn Roe v. Wade, they also launched the long march. It took almost 50 years to change that law, okay? So we need to be a bit more patient. I think in terms of demography, we see a change. Also in terms of consciousness, when people are speaking about deep state, when people are suddenly understanding that, we have two realities. Half of the people watch Channel 14, half of the people watch Channel 12, which is the leftist. So they see different kind of perspective. I think this is a kind of progress to the solution. It's going to be very difficult because the stakes are high. They are most fearful. And they all the time use undemocratic method to protect themselves by approaching the Democratic Party in the US, the legacy media in the US, exerting pressure on the Israeli government by all kinds of indirect and illegitimate kind of method. So they are not really playing fair.
No, not really.
But eventually, I think more and more people, even moderate people like me who come from the moderate left-wing centric, if you are a decent person, and I consider myself to be decent, and when I see this power struggle, I said, this is not okay. It's not democratic. And I consider myself to be a liberal, democratic, and a Zionist, and I think 80% of the Israeli people believe in that. So you have very, very radical elites that try to maintain their power. And I'm trying to speak to the people on the left, on the center left, and say, these elites are actually protecting their interests and not your interests.
So there are two things. First, we have a debt that we have to pay, which is that I interrupted you when you were talking about what Esther Chayut did with overturning the reasonableness thing. So let's talk about that, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about the shifting discourse, and then
Okay. I'm a Democrat, and I look in comparative constitutional law in all kinds of other courts' decision, and look what is going on in Israel. The basic law are not entrenched. It's very easy to amend the basic law. You need a simple majority to change most of the basic law. So when the Israeli Knesset tried to change the basic law, the court was fearful. They said, now, by a simple majority, they can change all the system. So when the Israeli government launched the basic law, Israel as a Jewish state, which is a very consensual kind of law, the Israeli Supreme Court, led by Justice, which is now was the President Esther Chayut, ruled that it has the authority to strike down basic law on the doctrine of unconstitutional constitutional amendment. But the court says, we have the power, but we're going to use it only in very, very extreme cases that shock your conscience, that infringe the core of the democratic and the Jewish value of the state of Israel. You say, that's a very high standard. And then, during the constitutional reform and constitutional crisis, the government and the Israeli Knesset adopted the basic law, which mildly changed and narrowed the unreasonable test, which Aaron Barak in the 80s, as I mentioned before, extended dramatically in a way that does not happen anywhere across the globe.
That is unreasonable on its face.
And I said, how can the Israeli Supreme Court, under this very high standard that itself during the previous case, can strike down this basic law? And it did.
Right.
And that was amazing. And whenever people on the left say, well, Israel is not a democracy because it's not a substantive democracy, which actually means it does not support the values of us, okay? Israel, they're right. Israel is not a democracy. It is actually a juristocracy because the source of legitimacy is not we the people. The source of legitimacy is the mind of judges that pick up values from the sky and decide that this kind of a very minor amendment to the basic law, which is based on democratic principle, violates the core principle of the state of Israel.
Which they make up as they go.
Yeah, and that was basically a signal. It was a signal, don't mess with us.
Yeah.
Whenever you're trying to change the composition of the selection of judges committee, that's the main issue, well, if we strike down this minor basic law, we would definitely strike down any attempt of yours to change this composition. I want to say something because Israel is a common law country. And in common law countries, courts do not have the power to strike down laws and usually are very restrained in terms of intervening in kind of political issues. But under this kind of system, you need professional judges because they are not political. But what Aaron Barak did, it changed the DNA of the legal system from a professional one to a highly politicized one. Now the politicians said, well, you have political power. We want to regulate that. It doesn't make sense that under the professionalism standard, you actually bring your own people, which are leftist and progressive. We want to diversify the court, which is a very legitimate political and moral stand. They are not willing to accept that. And that's a major struggle. And when you refer to the State Inquiry Commission, what you said very correctly. What the right wing is actually proposing is not a control of the right wing on this inquiry commission, but a paritatic commission.
An equal one with equal representation.
Yeah, but you know what's the problem in the age of political polarization? We don't only struggle about values, we also don't agree about facts.
Right.
That's a major problem. You know, Americans are very much familiar with this kind of problem, but it also happens in Israel. But you know, if you're looking for a sign of hope, you know, in America, it's impossible to create a unitary government because it's a two-party system. In Israel, it's a democratic system, multi-party system. When you can create a unitary government, and that might be the hope, because during times of this kind of government, the level of political polarization declines.
What do you mean?
You know, when you cooperate.
What kind of unitary government?
ממשלת אחדות.
Oh,
unified. Yeah, unity or unified government. You know, when you have this kind of government, then
you're talking about bringing in like a Benny Gantz and
you know, some kind of.
But he paralyzed the government when he was there. He paralyzed the government even just when he was in the war cabinet, and he certainly paralyzed the government when he was a co-prime minister.
Caroline, there is a cost to every move. I think what we need now is to set very clear rule of the game, and if you can agree upon this basic principle and entrench them in a constitution that gives people from the right wing the possibility to draft or to diversify the Israeli Supreme Court, that's a lot. That's a progress for the right wing.
Let me just give you a scenario that popped into my mind when you were talking about it. So immediately I'm starting to, think, how would we do this? Because the left-wing parties that you have in the Knesset today, they view themselves and their voters view them as the repositories of the will of the Supreme Court. That they're there because they agree that the source of legitimacy in Israel is we the justices of the Supreme Court and not we the people. And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, well then maybe you could start a political party just theoretically, and you get 5 mandates of liberals like yourselves who are fair-minded. But you have already been delegitimized by the justices parties. So that even if you come into the government with, your 5 mandates or your 10 mandates, your 15 mandates, who cares? Like Dash, you come in with your mandates, none of those mandates are considered legitimate anymore because now they're willing to cooperate with the right and will get the same riots in the streets. So that any left-winger, for, just to use that nomenclature, who comes over to the right is immediately castigated and therefore delegitimized, and therefore nothing that he does is actually going to bring domestic tranquility to Israel because...
That's the tragedy of the left and also of the woke, because whoever does not agree with them automatically becomes a fascist,
right.
Becomes delegitimized. But, if you look at the Israeli government, now we have 64 votes for the coalition, and then you have Gideon Sa'ar, who joined the government, as a 68. And let's imagine one day that Avigdor Lieberman, at some polls, he has 15 mandates, okay? Also to join this government, okay? And his position is for a constitutional court that is being nominated by the Israeli government, okay? By the Israeli Knesset. So you have 75 members of the Knesset. Numbers do count. If you are above 70, it is going to be extremely difficult for the Supreme Court to strike down the law, because what the court said, that, well,
they care.
That's a big question, okay? Sometimes I also ask myself, because, there is a joke in the show that I participate in, the Patriots, which one of my analyst friends is saying, well, you're a constitutional law professor. There is no such
there's no such profession.
Yeah, and there's no such profession.
Law is basically reading comprehension.
Well, I'm saying, well, he's right, to a sense, because, I used to analyze cases in terms of doctrine, in terms of principles. And now the first thing I ask whenever I approach a case is, who are the judges?
Mm-hmm.
Are they conservative? Are they liberal? And then that's a proxy for what the court decision is going to be. What I realized during the constitutional crisis is that it is much more important to know who interpret the Constitution than what is in the Constitution.
Benny Elon, the rabbi who was a member of Knesset, used to say that he was opposed to to making a constitution for Israel. And he said, I wouldn't agree if they said that the Ten Commandments were Israel's constitution. I wouldn't agree, because it would be the Supreme Court justices who'd be interpreting them.
I think Aryeh Deri said it. That's a very, very famous saying. And
you think that Aryeh Deri said it?
I think okay. Maybe they duplicated from another. But
we're each plagiarizing one another.
That's a very sensible kind of saying. The question. No one really cared about whether there's going to be the right to equality or anti-discrimination they only cared about who interpret the Constitution, the judges and the legal advisor. And by the way, if you look at what is called Mitveh Ha'am, which is what the Israelis...
the people's choice or something?
The people's choice, what the Israeli president actually attempted to provide some kind of a compromise during the constitutional crisis. And, there was a shift in two elements in this kind of compromise vis-a-vis what we actually agreed with the right-winger from Kohelet. First, the composition of the nomination committee to the Supreme Court. And second, the composition and the power of the legal advisor. They really know, the left-wingers, that the most important question is personnel. Who are the people that interpret the Constitution?
So they were willing to compromise on that?
No, they're not.
They weren't.
It is where there was a shift from what we actually agreed with the right-wingers to what actually was launched from the President Hall during the constitutional crisis. So this kind of compromise was not really a compromise. No, it was very much shifted to the left.
Yeah, there's never a compromise. That's the whole problem. But I'll tell you, if you're talking about changing the DNA of things, I would argue that, one of the reasons I can't stand listening to Channel 12 or Channel 11 or any of the other ones really is because they're boring, then they're stupid. The intellectual level of the discourse is so low because it's all personal and there's no facts and it's just feelings and it's just anger and hatred and vitriol against the Prime Minister and anybody who supports him. That they're boring. I mean, aside from everything else, I find them extremely annoying and boring. And I have to say that listening to, I think that people are are also, they're drawn to the Patriotim and to Channel 14 in general because you don't feel like you're getting your intelligence insulted all the time.
I come from the academia, okay? And I look around and I see so many smart people that went to Harvard and they are very articulate. This is the H-bomb.
I went to Harvard.
And once politics steps in, they become stupid.
Yeah, they totally.
And by the way, there are researches actually showing that the smarter you are, once politics gets in, the dumber you get. Okay.
Well, at least you're remaining smart, or you decide you made up the decision.
That's right.
You were forced. You were at that T junction, and you were forced to decide: do I go with my people, or do I maintain my basic intelligence? And you did the latter.
Yes, I went back to the people because I'm democratic and they are not. That's true.
Well, maybe that'll change the DNA of enough people on the left to...
Very few people are courageous enough because I pay very high prices. I'm being, canceled because there was some kind of woke law professor from Tel Aviv University who launched a Facebook post that I go to Channel 14 and I'm almost like a fascist person. And he deleted it, but he made the kind of damage. So I don't care. I'm willing to pay the prices, but very few people are willing to do it.
Fun.
Yeah, I'm doing it.
You look like a happy warrior. I see.
Courageous. There are some benefits for that.
I can attest to that 100%. If you do the right thing, you always get paid for it in one way.
Yeah, I agree with you, definitely, Caroline.
All right. Moshe Cohen-Eliya, yeah. All right. Moshe Cohen-Eliya, it was a pleasure to have you on the show and talk to you. I think I'm going to have you back just because you're great to talk to.
It's going to Jerusalem. It's far, but it's worthwhile.
It's worth coming here from time to time.
You're doing an amazing job, yeah. And also watch some of your TV show. It's amazing.
Look at that. Hey, okay, I'm definitely having you back. All right.
I'm smart.
Hey, you know which side the bread's buttered on. All right. Anyway, I'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much, and I'll be back with another In Focus later this week as well. So stay tuned. All right. Take care.